Hello. In The Rise of Adventism, Edwin Scott Gaustad, editor, we've reached chapter 7. This is written by Ernest R. Sandeen, who had written a very famous book on millennialism. That is, the book was called The Roots of Fundamentalism. And here he gets to write the essay on how the idea of the millennium built up in the world just before Millerism, and then of course the cults like Jehovah's Witnesses and the Christadelphians came along. The millennium was already in the air, and Ernest Sandeen here explains how that happened in the period at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. He says that millenarianism should have played a prominent part in the history of early 19th century America and Britain has seemed to many a puzzling and inexplicable fact. Millenarian popularity seemed scandalous even to some citizens of that century, who felt their nations too enlightened to offer a home to such outlandish doctrines. In order to explain the enigma of 19th century millenarianism, an intellectual journey of some distance will be required. Millenarianism can scarcely be understood except through an analysis of the character of millennialism generally, and the history of Christian apocalyptic millenarianism specifically. Similarly, the social history of early 19th century Britain and America requires some comment, especially since many of the common textbook notions of early Victorian society and Jacksonian America have been discarded by contemporary historians. In the scope of so short a paper, it will prove impossible to offer a complete discussion, but it is hoped that the reader will find here some help in solving the puzzle of 19th century millenarianism. Millennialism is the cosmology of eschatology, a chronology of future events comparable to the historical record of the past. In the same manner as historians construct a pattern explanation of events 10, 20, or 100 years ago, so too do some persons build elaborate scenarios of events anticipated 50, 100, or 1,000 years in the future. Those expectations of whatever character are in theology known as millennialism. The word derives from the 20th chapter of Revelation, where there occurs a reference to a period of 1,000 years, the Latin word for which would be millennium. Most contemporary Americans seem to believe that millennialism is an old-fashioned and outmoded notion. Yet an analysis of the presidential addresses of Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, or John F. Kennedy would reveal an explicit, although secularized, millennial pattern. You will remember their agenda for the New Freedom, the New Deal, and New Frontier. These programs contained are projections of the expectations of American society. Karl Marx's prophecy of a classless society and Adolf Hitler's 1,000-year Reich were other powerful 20th century forms of millennialism, but of course they are not Christian millennial schemes. In the Christian tradition, all millennial theologies involve the triumph of Christ, the vindication of the suffering saints, and the eventual reign of Christ on the earth. But there are a number of classic variations to the millennial schemes which have separated Christians, on occasions, into wildly warring camps. Christ came the first time about 1973 years ago. This is written at the beginning of the 70s. And he is, according to every millennialist, going to return to this earth again. But is his triumph considered to be near or distant? This variation of millennial thought usually correlates with the prominence of the doctrine of the second advent in the church at any one time. If people believe that the coming of Christ is near, they tend to emphasize the doctrine. If they feel that it is distant, the doctrine is neglected and often forgotten entirely. Christians have also disagreed whether Christ's second coming would be silent or cataclysmic. The first advent of Christ was quiet indeed. Many 19th century millennialists thought that the second advent would take place as unobserved as the first, a silent stealing away of the true believers. A favorite sermon illustration of 19th century millenarians, which was still being repeated in my childhood, told of a child awaking to find its mother and father gone, taken silently to heaven. But since the second coming of Christ was most often thought of as a triumph, It was more often pictured in contrast to the first advent. Christ might have come quietly the first time, but the second time he was expected to return with the fanfare of trumpets, a public appearance in glory, and recognition as a king. Thus the tendency has been for Adventists to place their emphasis upon the cataclysmic coming of Christ. Third, will the coming be gradual or swift? There have been Christians in several eras of church history who have believed that the coming of Christ would be accomplished gradually, that the Spirit of Christ would slowly permeate society until finally, one day, everyone would recognize that Christ had in fact manifested himself. Jonathan Edwards can be cited as an example of a historian and theologian who believed in the gradual accomplishment of the second advent. Edwards had an astonishing faith in the progress of the gospel, so great that he felt able to predict the coming of Christ sometime toward the end of the 20th century, more than 200 years after his own time. But most watchers for the second coming of Christ cannot wait as long as Jonathan Edwards was willing to wait. Often they find themselves in emergency situations, threatened, about to go under, like those believers for whom the book of Daniel was written. The author of Daniel predicted relief that was to be near, cataclysmic, and swift. The combination of these three characteristics scholars define as apocalypticism. In ordinary usage, the meaning of apocalypticism has been stretched to cover virtually any dramatic announcement. One might, for example, hear a speaker proclaim that if the smog in Los Angeles continues to worsen, the city will have to be abandoned. Rather than resembling the apocalyptic message of Daniel, such a warning bears a far closer resemblance to an earlier Old Testament tradition. The prophecies of Daniel stand in striking contrast to those of Old Testament prophets like Jeremiah or Isaiah. Their testimony to the ancient Hebrews might be summarized as a warning that unless the people changed their wicked behavior, they would be visited by divine retribution. But that was not Daniel's message. The characteristic feature of his prophecy was his prediction of a reversal of worldly expectations through a violent supernatural intervention in the course of history. In apocalypticism, then, one was not given a denunciation of present society or nostalgic recollections about a lost Eden. He received, instead, the promise of salvation now, swiftly and cataclysmically. Anthropologists have recorded examples of apocalyptic millenarianism among many pre-literate peoples whose societies have been threatened by Western expansion. Among Indians of the Western Plains in the United States during the last half of the 19th century, there grew up a ghost dance religion, which gave solace to many tribes whose lands were being seized by white settlers and whose cultures were in danger of collapse from the pressure of white encroachment. Indian prophets or visionaries taught that this imminent peril would be averted by the return of the ghosts of the dead ancestors and a simultaneous mudslide or avalanche that would bury the white civilization while the believing Indians danced over the Holocaust. During and immediately following World War II, natives of New Guinea and some of the neighboring island chains became converts to a type of apocalypticism usually described by anthropologists as cargo cults. In this case, the natives would burn or destroy their villages and belongings and sit down to await the arrival of a magical ship which they believed would deliver its cargo of goods and gifts to the expectant believers. Apocalyptic millenarianism was commonly taught and believed in the early Christian church. The book of Revelation was written to encourage Christians suffering persecution under the Emperor Nero, a group also threatened with extinction. Now, I need to point out there that he's in the minority who believe it was written during the reign of Nero. Most now believe it's in Domitian's reign at the end of the first century. The same eschatology is reflected in some early church fathers, such as Irenaeus. But after the official conversion of the Roman state to Christianity, the movement waned. A new doctrine of the millennium, developed particularly by the great African saint Augustine, described the millennium as a spiritual state, not a physical one. The millennium, Augustine taught, was a state into which every believer could enter by way of the sacraments and other means of grace. Although this doctrine became the only acceptable teaching concerning the millennium during the Middle Ages, outbreaks of apocalyptic millenarianism, then treated as a heresy, continued to occur. The most famous of these were probably from the 16th and 17th centuries, especially among Germans in the city of Munster, who were besieged by Catholic soldiers of the Archbishop and who adopted apocalyptic millenarian beliefs at the height of their siege. Their leaders, like the believers in Daniel's day, proclaimed that their siege would be relieved and that God would come to their aid cataclysmically and swiftly, thus averting their imminent destruction. A similar movement took place at the end of the English Civil War, that would be in the 1640s and 50s, when nothing short of divine intervention seemed capable of saving the few who still clung to the grand old cause. In this case, the millenarians were named the Fifth Monarchy men because they felt that the solution to the critical government crisis afflicting the English at that time, that is 1660, was to proclaim Christ ruler of their country. It's a reference to the four kingdoms in Daniel chapters 2 and 7. So the fifth monarchy is the kingdom of Christ. And then Sandeen concludes this portion with this paragraph. Without citing further examples of this kind, let me generalize about the advocates and followers of these movements. Typical apocalyptic millenarians were outcasts. They seldom exercised authority within their own political system, nor were they able to control their existential situation. On the other hand, they were viewed by the authorities as heretical and revolutionary types, and were, I would emphasize again, like the Jews of Daniel and the Christians of Revelation, threatened with destruction. More to come in Sandeen's analysis of the growth of millennialism in the early part of the 19th century. I'll put in a link to Leon Morris's discussion of the nature of apocalyptic